Take that off. Put it back on the rack where you found it. A gown like that was never cut for a woman like you. Delphine Carter didn't so much as blink. The words hit the marble and skidded. Around her, the atelier, all brass fixtures and chandelier glass and the particular hush that only very expensive rooms know how to make, stopped breathing all at once. A clerk near the register found something urgent to study on the floor. A woman by the window turned a few careful degrees away, her wine glass stalled halfway to her mouth. A man in a dinner jacket cleared his throat and measured the distance to the door with his eyes. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Because the woman doing the screaming, and she was screaming now, whatever polish she'd walked in with stripped clean off, was Song Min Seo. And in Seoul's tallest circles, you did not step between Song Min Seo and anything she had decided to ruin. She came forward in a pale ivory suit, stones at her throat catching every drop of light. One lacquered finger aimed at Delphine's face, like something she'd been waiting all evening to draw. Do you have any idea what you're standing in? Her voice split on the last word, the particular fracture of a person who has never once heard the word no and lived with it. That is an archive piece, a dynastic gown. It was made for women with names, with lineage. Her eyes went down Delphine's body and back up, slow, unhurried. That wasn't rudeness. That was a ruling. Not for tourists who wander in off the sidewalk and think they're allowed to touch what was never theirs. The vents hummed overhead. Behind the counter, a hanger scraped a rack. That was the entire soundtrack. Delphine looked at the finger, then at the face behind it. And then, this was the part that genuinely unsettled Min Seo. She smiled. Not a polite smile. Not a nervous one. The slow, private smile of a woman who has already run the arithmetic on how the evening ends and found the answer quietly funny. Are you finished? Delphine asked. I haven't begun. Min Seo closed the distance. I will have you removed. I will have that dress taken off your body if I have to call every. That won't be necessary. The voice came from behind them both. Low, level, the kind of voice that has never once had to raise itself. The temperature in that room changed. Not gradually, instantly, like a window had opened somewhere and something cold and precise had stepped through it. The clerk behind the counter straightened without deciding to. The woman by the window set her glass down at last. Even Min Seo's finger, still hanging in the air an inch from Delphine's cheek, dropped. Then dropped again. Then her whole arm fell to her side like the order had come from a place she didn't know how to argue with. Delphine turned. He came out of the shadow at the back of the atelier without hurrying, because hurrying was for men who had somewhere to be that wouldn't wait. Tall, Korean, dressed head to foot in black, suit cut so precisely it read less like clothing and more like a second opinion about the shape of him. Black shirt, dark hair pushed back from a face that was still in the way deep water is still. In his left hand, held down at his side like something he'd forgotten he was carrying, was a lacquered case trimmed in gold. Han Duyun crossed that floor in 6 unhurried steps. He stopped beside Delphine, not in front of her, not behind her, beside her, at exactly the distance that says everything without saying anything. And when he looked at Min Seo, it wasn't anger. It was worse. It was mild interest, and even that seemed generous. You were saying, he said. Min Seo's mouth opened. Nothing came out of it. Duyun glanced once at Delphine. Just a glance, but the kind that reads a whole page. Then, without letting Min Seo out of his sight, he set the case on the display table and pressed the latches open. The lid rose. And the entire room, every frozen clerk, every horrified onlooker, every person elaborately pretending not to watch, forgot how breathing worked. In the dark red lining sat a coronet that caught the chandelier and threw it back across the ceiling in 100 broken stars. Beneath it, a collar of diamonds and sapphires so heavy it seemed unfair that something so beautiful could also look so dangerous. Beside that, the matching pieces that scholars had written about for decades and that the Korean Cultural Ministry had moved heaven and a mountain of paperwork to bring home. The same pieces Delphine Carter, the most decorated jewelry archivist the ministry had ever put under contract, had been flown across an ocean to authenticate. Duyun lifted the coronet from the velvet. He turned to her, and in a Seoul atelier, surrounded by the wealthiest and most paralyzed people in the city, he set the crown on Delphine Carter's head with the slow, deliberate certainty of a man who is not making a gesture. He is making a record. He stepped back. He looked at Min Seo. You were discussing. He said quietly who this dress was made for. Minasio said nothing. Look at her, Diyun said, and tell me what you see. The room held its breath. Delphine stood in the deep blue gown, sapphires at her collarbone, the crown sitting above her curls like it had lived there all its life. Her chin was up. Her eyes, warm, dark, entirely unbothered, moved from the trembling socialite to the man beside her, and something quiet passed between them that every person in that room could feel and none of them could name. Minasio's face had traveled from fury down to something smaller. Something that, underneath the stones and the ivory suit and the lacquer, looked almost like fear. Because she was starting to understand, too late, the way her kind always does, that she had walked into a room and picked the wrong woman to scream at. She had no idea yet how wrong. That part was still coming. Before we go on, if this story is pulling you in, take a second to subscribe to Afro Korean Drama and hit that like button. And tell me in the comments, where in the world are you watching from tonight? I read every single one. Now let's get back to it. Nobody moved. That was the thing Delphine would remember later, when the city lights were far below her and the noise of the night had finally gone quiet. Not the screaming, not the finger aimed at her face like a charge being filed. What she would remember was the stillness of everybody else. The way a room full of people, clerks in pressed uniforms, customers in silk, a floor manager whose whole job was supposedly to make an evening pleasant, quietly agreed among themselves that what was happening to her was not their business. She had been in that atelier exactly 22 minutes. She'd found the gown on the third rack, wedged between two pale things that were beautiful the way costly items often are. Technically perfect, entirely forgettable. But the blue one had stopped her cold. The fabric was a shade so deep it barely seemed permitted. The bodice worked in gold thread so fine it looked like someone had understood that real beauty is only patience made visible. She had lifted it off the rack. She had felt the weight of it in her hands. She had carried it to the fitting room the way you carry something you already know belongs to you. Without ceremony, without asking. She was standing at the mirror, diamond drops swinging at her ears, the gown fitting the architecture of her body like it had been drafted from a blueprint of her, when the door opened and Minasio walked in. No knock, no pause, just a woman who had decided, somewhere between the front entrance and that moment, that the ordinary rules of human conduct were for other people. Take it off. Delphine had looked at her own reflection first. Then, slowly, at the woman behind it. I'm sorry. You heard me. Minasio's voice had the edge of something sharpened daily and on purpose, against people who couldn't afford to push back. That dress isn't yours. It was never going to be yours. Take it off and put it back. Here's the thing. This was the exact moment where another woman might have flinched, might have apologized on reflex, the way people apologize when somebody walks into them, might have reached for the zipper simply because the air in the room was demanding it and nobody was offering her an alternative. Delphine turned around. She looked at Minasio the way a woman looks at something she's deciding whether to take seriously. She took in the ivory suit, the swept-back hair, the stones at the ears and throat, impressive the way borrowed importance is always impressive, loud, obvious, slightly desperate. No, just that. One word, flat and final as a door closing. Something crossed Minasio's face. It began as surprise, moved fast through disbelief, and settled into a cold, ugly fury that had clearly been living just under the surface a long while, waiting for exactly this kind of invitation. She'd come out of the fitting area onto the main floor still talking, still pointing, her voice climbing with every step until it stopped being a voice and became a performance. The kind built to gather an audience, to make the shaming public, to guarantee that whatever came next came with witnesses. The room did that thing rooms do when nobody wants to pick a side. Not the silence of comfort. The silence of complicity. The floor manager appeared at the edge of it, and then became deeply absorbed in a display of handbags near the far wall. A clerk who had, 10 minutes earlier, brought Delphine a glass of water now seemed unable to recall her existence. Delphine stood in the middle of all of it. Still, chin up, the gown pooling at her feet like it had made its own decision about where it wanted to be. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't lower her eyes. She had learned a long time ago that this particular creature shows up everywhere. Auction houses, museum boardrooms. The private viewing rooms of collectors who assumed her credentials were a clerical error. She had stopped being surprised by it somewhere around her 4th year. I'm going to need you, Delphine said, very quietly, to lower your finger. I will have you removed, Mafia said, and her voice cracked on the last word, the way a voice does when the person using it realizes it isn't working. I will call every attendant in this building. I will have security here in 60 seconds. I will have that dress taken off your. That won't be necessary. And everything stopped. Not the polite stop of an interrupted conversation. The absolute, cellular stop of people who have just registered something they instinctively understand to be dangerous. The floor manager looked up. The clerk by the handbags went rigid. Mafia's mouth stayed open around the end of her sentence, but no more sound came out of it. Han Duyun crossed that floor without hurrying. Every step landed with the quiet of a man who learned early that silence, deployed correctly, is louder than anything else. Mr. Han, she started, and the edge was gone from her voice completely, replaced with something thin and careful. I was only explaining to this woman that the dress she's wearing. I heard what you were explaining, Dean said. His voice held no particular emotion, which somehow made it worse than if it had. I heard all of it. For a long moment, nothing. Then the latches. Then the lid. Then a room full of Seoul's finest forgetting how to breathe. The coronet sat in the lining like something that had been waiting. It was extraordinary in the way genuinely old things sometimes are. Not flashy, not performing its own beauty. Just existing in the complete confidence of a thing that has always known exactly what it's worth. And when Duyun placed it in Delphine's curls, the story of that evening began traveling, word by word, to every dinner table and private lounge and whispered conversation in the city, until it became the kind of story that changes the shape of a room when it walks in. Mafia looked at Delphine, at the crown, at the sapphires, at the blue gown that had made its own decision and was apparently final about it. Her face moved through several expressions. None of them were dignity. She laughed. Once. Ugly. Then she turned and walked out of that atelier with the stiff, mechanical gait of a woman whose entire body is dedicated to the single task of not visibly coming apart before she reaches the street. The room exhaled. Duyun looked at Delphine for a long moment. She looked back with the same steady, evaluating attention she'd given the dress. The look of a woman who takes inventory before she commits to anything. The ministry sent you, he said. It wasn't a question. The ministry sent me, she confirmed. Something moved at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile. The suggestion of one, from a face that had apparently decided smiling was a resource worth rationing. You have to understand. What you knew about Delphine Carter before she walked into that atelier fit inside one ministry briefing document. For pages, heavily redacted, with a photograph attached that had not, he was now privately noting, done her the slightest justice. The document told him this. She was 41 years old. She had studied on 2 continents and finished both programs early. She had authenticated more than 400 historical artifacts in 19 years, with a focus on royal and dynastic work, and her error rate was 0. She had turned down 4 permanent institutional posts in the last 3 years, preferring contract work that kept her moving, kept her independent, kept her answerable to no calendar but her own. She was, in the language of people who did what Duyun did, exactly the kind of person you wanted in a room and exactly the kind of person you were never quite sure you could keep there. Over the next 3 days, he learned everything the file hadn't told him. He learned that she took her coffee black and drank it standing up, always, as though sitting down with it would constitute a degree of settling and she hadn't authorized. He learned she laughed at things that weren't obviously funny and went completely silent at things that were, processing them somewhere private before deciding whether to let them surface. He learned she could name the provenance of a piece of metalwork from across a room and lay out its history in the kind of detail that made other experts go quiet. That specific quiet of people recalibrating what expertise actually looks like. And he learned that she was entirely unbothered by him. This was, in his experience, unusual. Not because he was accustomed to fear, though he was, and he understood its uses, and he spent it the way a surgeon spends a scalpel. Precisely. Minimally. Only when necessary. But even the people who weren't afraid of him were performing something in his presence. Performing ease. Performing confidence. Performing the relaxed indifference of someone who badly wants you to believe they're relaxed and indifferent. Delphine performed nothing at all. When he brought the pieces to the ministry's authentication suite on the second morning, She pulled on her gloves and lifted each one with the focus of a woman whose whole attention had relocated to her fingertips. And she talked about what she found the way a person talks when she's forgotten anyone else is in the room. The sapphires are late Josian, she said. The setting on the central stone predates the occupation, consistent with Royal Workshop records from 1897. And the coronet was built for a specific head, sized smaller than the European fashion of the period. Which means domestic commission, not import. Which means... She stopped, looked up, found him watching. Sorry, she said, without sounding sorry at all. I do that. I know, he said. I've been watching you do it for 40 minutes. She looked at him with that same inventory-taking attention. And you're the most interesting person who's been inside this building in a very long time. She picked up the next piece. That's a low bar, she said. This is a government building. He found that considerably funnier than he let his face admit. On the third day, he told her about the gala. The Heritage Crown Gala was, on its surface, the city's most prestigious annual celebration of cultural history. Black tie, the grand hall of the Seoul Regent. Ministers, old money families, institution heads, and that specific category of extremely wealthy person who prefers their money to come with historical credibility attached. On its surface, below the surface, and Duyan lived his whole professional life below the surface of things. It was the single most important evening on the Seoul elite calendar. The one night where alliances got announced, where debts got called in, where the people who actually ran things made it known, in the particular language of who stood next to whom, exactly where matters stood. He needed Delphine there. Her credentials, her authentication, her professional authority as the ministry's appointed archivist. They were the last piece of an operation he'd been running quietly for 14 months. The end of a recovery effort that had crossed 3 countries and 2 very dangerous networks to put those pieces back on Korean soil. He told her some of it. Not all of it. Enough. She listened without interrupting. What she had already learned was how she listened to everything. Completely. Without filling the silence with herself. You want me at the gala, she said. I want you at the gala wearing the crown, he said. And the dress. A pause. The blue dress. Yes. She looked at him a long moment. He could watch her running the calculation, what it meant, what it would cost, what it would expose her to. And he watched her reach the end of it and arrive somewhere that surprised him slightly. She didn't ask if it was safe. She didn't ask what happened if it went wrong. She asked exactly one question. Will Minicio be there? Yes, he said. Something shifted in her expression. Not quite a smile. The suggestion of one. From a face he was beginning to understand rationed smiling as carefully as his own. Then yes, she said. I'll be there. She stood, stripping off her gloves with the efficient finality of a woman whose decision is already behind her. But I need the dress back by Thursday. It has to be steamed. He looked at her. The dress, he said slowly, is already yours. She paused at the door, turned back, looked at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. Something between surprise and recognition, like a suspicion had just been confirmed. She nodded once. Then she laughed. And that was the moment Duyun understood that Thursday was going to be one of the more important nights of both their lives. He also had a feeling Minicio had no idea at all what was walking toward her. He was right about both. The Heritage Crown Gala was the kind of beautiful that makes you forget, briefly, that beautiful things can also be traps. The Grand Hall of the Seoul Regent had been dressed the way old money dresses for everything, with the confidence of people who never had to try, because the trying was finished generations ago, and all that's left is upkeep. Chandeliers the size of small cars. A ceiling painted with Joseon Dynasty scenes. White and gold on every table. The flowers were real. The champagne was cold. And the people moving between them were dressed with the precision of a social class that understands appearance at an event like this isn't vanity. It's strategy. Delphine walked in on Duyun's arm and felt the room change. Not all at once. It moved in waves, the way awareness moves through a crowd. One person noticing, turning slightly, that turn catching the corner of the next person's eye, and the next, until the ripple had reached every wall, and the whole hall was doing the thing rooms do when something has entered that they can't categorize yet. She was wearing the blue dress. Of course she was. And above the gold thread at her neckline, above the diamond drops at her ears, above the composed and unhurried expression of a woman who has decided exactly what tonight is and made her peace with it, The crown caught the light of every chandelier in the room and handed it back multiplied. It sat in her curls like it had been patient, like it had simply been waiting for the right head. Duyun said nothing beside her. He didn't need to. His hand rested at the small of her back, and his eyes were already moving across the room with the quiet efficiency of a man cataloging threats and exits before a single word gets spoken. She recognized faces from ministry files. Ministers, institution directors, 3 members of the Parliamentary Heritage Committee, old families whose names sat on buildings and endowments that stretched back far enough to feel like geography rather than biography. She recognized Min Seo immediately. Min Seo was standing at the far end beside a man in his late 60s, silver hair, and the posture of someone who has spent decades being deferred to. Shoulders back, chin slightly elevated. The look of a man who experiences other people primarily as an audience. Minister Beck. She'd read his file twice. Cultural Heritage Portfolio. 15 years in office. 17 commendations. And a private financial history that her ministry contact had described, in a careful, bureaucratic whisper, as complicated. Delphine had her own word for it. She kept it to herself. Min Seo saw her. The reaction was not subtle. Something crossed her face that started as recognition and moved fast through disbelief and fury into something new. Something calculating. Something cold that had not been in the atelier. In the atelier, Min Seo had been running on reflex, the automatic cruelty of a person who has never once been checked. Tonight she had come prepared. Delphine watched her lean toward Minister Beck and say something close to his ear. Watched him look across the room. Watched his face do the same arithmetic and reach the same cold total. She felt Duyun's hand press very slightly at her back. "They're moving," he said, in a voice that reached only her. "I see them." Delphine. She looked at him. "Whatever happens in the next 10 minutes," he said, "do not move from where you are standing until it's finished. And if they call security, let them." She studied him, ran the calculation, found, at the end of it, that she trusted him, not blindly, not without full awareness of who he was and what he ran and what the weight of his hand at her back actually represented, but trusted him the way you trust a well-constructed argument, because the logic holds. She nodded. She lifted a glass of champagne from a passing tray. She waited. She didn't wait long. Minister Beck moved through that hall with the practiced ease of a man who'd been performing authority in rooms like it for 15 years. He stopped in the center of the floor, near the main table, where enough people were gathered to constitute an audience. He turned. He looked at Delphine with an expression of theatrical concern she recognized instantly as rehearsed. "Forgive me." His voice carried. It was built to, "I'm sorry to interrupt the evening, but a matter of some urgency has been brought to my attention." The room pulled toward him the way rooms pull toward authority when it performs concern. Conversation stopped. Heads turned. The social gravity of a very important man looking distressed draws people in like weather. "Those pieces," he said, and his eyes found Delphine with something she could only call practiced sorrow. "The jewelry this woman is wearing was reported stolen from the National Heritage Vault 3 weeks ago." The hall went completely silent. "I don't know how they came into her possession," Beck continued, in the regretful tone of a man deeply unhappy to be doing what he is doing. "But I am obligated, as the minister responsible for this portfolio, to ask hotel security to detain her pending investigation." Min Seo, just behind him, had arranged her face into an expression of grave civic concern that would have convinced anybody who hadn't watched her screaming in an atelier 3 days earlier. 2 guards in hotel uniform were already moving in from the edges. The crowd had shaped itself into the formation people take when they're horrified and cannot stop watching. A wide unconscious circle that gives the scene room to breathe and guarantees that nothing about to happen will be private. Delphine set her glass down on the nearest table. She opened the small clutch in her hand, took out a folded document, and lifted it. "Ministry of Culture, Heritage and Arts," she said. Her voice was even and clear and reached every corner of that hall without effort. The voice of a woman who has spent years presenting findings to rooms full of people who did not initially want to believe what they were hearing. Official Authentication Commission. Dated 6 weeks ago. I am Delphine Carter, contracted Chief Archivist for the Crown Recovery Authentication Project. These pieces were signed into my personal custody for the duration of the authentication period, which, She glanced down at the page with the unhurriedness of someone who already knows precisely what it says. Does not conclude until the end of this month. She folded it. She looked at Beck. They aren't stolen, Minister. They're exactly where the ministry put them. The silence was a different kind now. Before, it had been shock. Now it was a room recalibrating. That cognitive lurch of people who walked in with one understanding of a situation and are working out, very quickly, what the new one means and what it means that the old one was wrong. Beck's face didn't move. He was far too experienced for that. But something behind his eyes had begun running a calculation that was not producing the answer he'd budgeted for. That documentation, he said, and the warmth had gone out of his voice, would need to be verified. Of course, Delphine said. I'd suggest you call Deputy Minister Ryu. He signed it. A pause. He's standing directly behind you. Beck turned. Deputy Minister Ryu, who was indeed standing directly behind him, gave him the look of a man who has been waiting a very long time to give it. Something cracked in that room. Not literally. The sound the atmosphere makes when a structure that has been holding gives along its own fault lines. The social collapse of a public story falling apart in real time in front of every single person it was built to fool. Beck turned back to the room. He was still performing composure. It was costing him now, visibly. This is highly irregular. What's irregular? Delphine said, and her voice did not change in volume or temperature, which somehow made it more devastating. Is a minister of cultural heritage attempting to have the ministry's own contracted archivist publicly arrested at a heritage gala? That's irregular. She looked at him steadily. The question this room should probably be asking is why you would want these particular pieces discredited. She let that sit for exactly the right number of seconds. Given that your signature, she continued, appears on the export documentation that moved them out of the National Vault in 2019 to a private collector in Macau. The room made a sound. Not a word. Not several. The collective involuntary sound of roughly 200 extremely composed, extremely controlled people all losing their composure slightly at the same instant. Menesio's face had gone the color of old paper. Beck's men moved first. That was the thing about corrupt men. They always kept a contingency. Two of them near the side entrance, in suits close enough to hotel security to survive a glance, but not quite right at the seams. They came across the floor with the forward momentum of a plan that has already decided it doesn't care about witnesses. The room lurched back. Gasps. Someone dropped a glass. The whole social performance of the evening collapsed into the older, more animal question of which direction was away. Delphine did not move. She stood exactly where she was, in the blue gown, with the crown in her hair, and she did not take one step backward. Because Diyun had told her not to, and because the logic held. Beck's men got 4 steps in. They stopped. Not because anyone told them to. Because the men who came out of the edges of that hall, from doorways, from service corridors, from positions along the wall they had held all evening without collecting a single glance, were standing in their path with a stillness so complete it was its own language. 6 of them, dressed as guests, unremarkable until this exact moment. Now occupying the room with the presence of people for whom a situation like this is not an emergency. It's a task. Nobody drew anything. Nobody raised a voice. Nobody needed to. Beck's men looked at each other, looked at the men in front of them, made the calculation people make when the body understands before the brain catches up that they are in something they were not actually prepared for. They stepped back. Diyun walked through the center of it without hurrying. He crossed that ballroom exactly the way he'd crossed the atelier 3 days before, with the unhurried certainty of a man who has already decided how this ends. He stopped beside Delphine. Not in front of her. Beside her. Same distance as before. He looked at Minister Beck. The pieces are authenticated, he said, quietly enough that only the nearest people heard, which somehow made it more final than anything said at full volume. The authentication goes before the full cultural committee tomorrow morning. The export documentation from 2019 will be included in that presentation. A pause. I'd suggest you spend the hours between now and then speaking to your lawyers. Not your guards. Beck looked at him a long moment. The calculation behind his eyes ran fast and produced nothing useful. 15 years in rooms like this, and he understood what had happened, that he had walked into the evening believing he held every card, and discovered too late that someone had been assembling a hand against him for over a year. He left. Not dramatically. The same stiff, mechanical exit as his daughter 3 days earlier. The gait of a person focused entirely on reaching the door intact. Minasio followed without looking back, without a final word, without anything at all except the small, terrible dignity of a woman with nothing left to perform. The ballroom breathed. The city was very far below them. The rooftop terrace was empty at that hour, the gala still running its final stunned movement somewhere beneath their feet, the sound of it distant and muffled. Seoul stretched out in every direction, lit towers, streaming traffic, and the restless energy of a city that doesn't sleep so much as change what it's doing in the dark. Delphine stood at the railing with her arms on the cold metal. She had taken the coronet out of her hair and was turning it slowly in both hands, letting the city lights travel through the stones. She'd done this a dozen times in authentication suites, held a piece under different light, watched how it changed. She had never done it quite like this. On a rooftop, in a blue dress, at the end of an evening that had gone further and faster than even she had mapped. Diyun stood beside her. He had loosened his tie. He was looking at the city with the expression of a man who knows a place the way you only know somewhere you fought for. They were quiet a while. It was a comfortable quiet, the kind that only exists between people who've been through something and don't need to debrief it. You knew, Delphine said eventually. About Beck. About all of it. Before the atelier. Yes, he said. The pieces. Your people recovered them from Minasio's father's network. 14 months ago, he said. Moving them back through the right channels without Beck intercepting them a second time required patience. She looked at him. And an archivist with federal credentials and a zero error rate. Something moved at the corner of his mouth. The ministry chose you, he said. I simply agreed with their choice. But you could have told me, she said. Not accusing. Just precise, the way she was about everything. From the beginning. You could have told me what it actually was. Yes, he said. Why didn't you? He was quiet a moment, looking out at the city. Because I needed to know, he said slowly, whether you'd stay when it got difficult. Not because you'd been briefed and prepared. Because you decided to. Delphine looked at him for a long time. Ran the calculation. The full one. The one that included who he was, and what he ran, and what it would mean to let a man like him into the specific geography of her trust. She had built that geography carefully, deliberately, across 19 years of walking into rooms where people underestimated her and learning, as a result, to keep her own counsel and rely on her own architecture. Hyper-independence, her colleagues called it. Like it was a flaw. Like the alternative, leaning on people who hadn't earned it, was obviously better. She looked down at the coronet in her hands. I don't do this, she said quietly. I know, he said. I don't let people. She stopped. Started again. I've spent 19 years being the most capable person in every room I walk into, and being very careful never to need anyone to confirm it. I know that too, he said. There was no judgment in it. No push. Just the same even quality she'd noticed from the first moment. The patience of a man who isn't trying to accelerate anything. She set the coronet on the railing between them. She looked at the city a moment more. Then she looked at him. I stayed, she said. Tonight. I didn't move. You didn't, he said. That was me deciding. Not because you told me to. I know the difference, he said. She was quiet a beat. Good, she said. The city ran its lights below them. Indifferent and beautiful and enormously alive. Somewhere beneath their feet the gala was winding down, the evening's damage already beginning its slow, irreversible spread through Seoul's networks. Beck's name attached to documentation that would not stay private. Minasio's family business entering the first hours of a reckoning 14 months in the making. The crown authenticated, home, and no longer anyone's leverage. Diyun picked the coronet up off the railing. He looked at it a moment. Then he looked at her. She held his gaze. The same steady, inventory-taking attention. The same composure that had stood unbothered in an atelier while an entire room flinched. That had held a document up in a ballroom full of Seoul's elite and not given a single step of ground. He placed the coronet back in her curls. Not with the ceremony of the atelier. Not as a statement for a room of witnesses. Quietly. Just for this rooftop. Just for the city below. Just for the two of them at the end of an evening that had changed the shape of things. Delphine reached up and touched it once, briefly, then let her hand fall. She looked out at the city. So, she said, what happens now? Diyun looked out too. Now, he said, we find out what comes next. Below them, Seoul burned bright and vast, and entirely unaware that two of the most formidable people it had ever produced had just decided, quietly and without announcement, to stop moving through it separately. The night held them, and the crown caught the light of 10,000 city windows and threw it back at the dark, exactly as it always had, exactly as it always would. Patient, brilliant, entirely certain of its own worth, and absolutely done waiting to be claimed. Thank you for spending this time with me here at Afro Korean Drama. If this story moved you, subscribe and share it with someone who needs to hear it, and I'll see you in the next one.